book on this long list bar one is maybe 100 pages long. People can discuss that however they want. As a reviewer, it's very helpful. Book 3 on the long list for me is Perfection by Vincenzo Latronico. This is a book about a couple who live in Berlin, and it's basically about how hopeless and miserable their lives are, and about how 21st century humans can't connect to anything anymore, and it's all miserable. And it's kind of about gentrification too, and I found it hopeless and depressing. It's a very short book. The comparison I thought of while I was reading it was it feels like the first few paragraphs of a non-fiction book, which is being used to lean you into the dissertation of what the book is about. If it's a book about, let's say, gentrification, there might be a narrative at the start of the book to kind of ease you into a non-fiction style, and it would read a little bit like this book here. That was my thought on it. Sometimes that really worked for me, sometimes I was chronically bored, and a lot of that came down to my personal preference about it. And I should say before I go any further that I do like the book, and I really respect and value what the author is trying to do here. But I did not like the book when it would explain the way characters were thinking in a way that we'd either already seen or that we could have no possible interpretation over, and he's just like talking down on them. I prefer to just interpret these things for myself than having them explained to me. The book begins with a long-ass description of an apartment, and when I was reading that I went, hell yeah, I get the point of this, I understand this completely, this is great. And I was hoping that the book would not break the immersion and interpretability of that and start talking to me like man to man as the book started to do, but it did, and I didn't really like that. Anna and Tom had grown up with the notion that individuality manifested itself as a set of visual differences, immediately decodable and in constant need of updating. People don't think like that. Maybe subconsciously they do, but you could infer that that was the way they thought about things, or that was the kind of fear they had, by just the way you had described things previously. You don't need to lecture us like that. There were a lot of statements that were made kind of above them, and it felt like the author was looking down on them and didn't really have any willingness to relate to them. Of course, it was history that had hollowed out that space. Anna and Tom understood this, or at least they would have if they had ever thought it through. Like, come on, meet them on their level, it's not fair. The reason I'm torn is because there were stretches of the book where it wasn't doing that and I was really enjoying it, and then there were sections that felt like a lecture and I could not stand it and I found myself very bored. But like, could you imagine if Bret Easton Ellis, halfway through his book said, now, Patrick Bateman didn't have to murder people if he had ever thought it through. That would make the commentary decidedly more lame. A section where the couple go to a sex party was great, and you really understood that the characters were going there out of a need to explore for exploration's sake. But then the author says they had a vague sense of shame that they couldn't put a name to, but that was always lurking, ready to make itself felt. We already know that. You don't have to say stuff like that. Just cut that out. At points, I really like the exhaustive psychological detail, like a lot of the discussion on sex. I thought that was all really good. But then, at points, it felt like something a teacher would say before they look at you disapprovingly and say, we wouldn't want that to happen to you, now would we? Here's another example of what I'm talking about. The shame they felt at their lack of self-control was really a failure on their part to adapt their thinking to the changing environment. Like, fuck off. Again, it feels like the half-assed narrative that runs parallel with a non-fiction book that is actually about a different topic. It feels like the author just wants to stop what they're doing and start putting facts and figures in and lecture you, but they don't. And a big reason why this criticism actually affected me is because there's enough in the book to where it doesn't have to do that, as I've kind of already implied. And some of the stuff he's talking about is so specific that it becomes a really valuable look into modern day, I guess, depression or ennui, and I would prefer the author just lets these images breathe. And occasionally my thoughts landed in the middle. A quote like, in their minds, the very idea of office work had something shameful and defeatist about it, although this feeling was far from clearly defined. I find that a valuable and relatable point, but again, I would just prefer it be expressed differently and rendered in a narrative way that doesn't just feel like a quote board. The book did improve over time for me, just by the virtue of it compounding what we already know. By the end, it felt like exhaustive. It felt like it had touched on every detail of modern day life, and it managed to hit all of these depression points and these possible escape routes from boredom, and the fact that none of them ever worked is hopeless and depressing, and I do respect that. And I was able to empathize with this book totally fine without any of these kind of godlike comments about how their lives could be better if they did something different. You know, I like the book overall though. I think there is value in it, and that's the end of book 3. Bye!